Hi there, and welcome to a special edition of the Studyclix Podcast. We've teamed up with an expert teacher, Peter Tobin, to bring you a limited podcast series all about Othello, the play by William Shakespeare.
Peter has recorded a series of podcasts for us where he goes into the specific aspects of what you need to know about Othello when you're studying it for the Leaving Cert. He covers everything from characters and different themes in the play to understanding Shakespeare's writing techniques and tips on approaching exam questions.
This is the second podcast in this series, and for this one, we're going to hear Peter go into detail about the character of Othello himself. First, he'll examine Othello and the many ways that he can be viewed, before moving on to explorations of Othello's character in response to some Leaving Cert exam questions.
So, the next voice that you'll hear is Peter's. Enjoy listening.
There are many ways of looking at the character of Othello, and so there are many things that you could write about him and be asked about him in a Leaving Cert question on character. The play itself has been interpreted in loads of different ways, from being a racist text to being nothing to do with race at all and actually all about class. This variety of perspectives comes from the wide-ranging debate about the purpose of Othello's character. Is Othello's race important? Or is it just something that marks him out as being different? Is it more important that he is male or upper class, rather than the fact that he is black? Critics have long argued that we don't really find out a great deal about the inner workings of Othello's mind, not like other title characters in Shakespeare's plays like Hamlet or Macbeth. Instead, all those soliloquies, those monologues delivered to the audience to show the inner workings or feelings of a character, they all go to Iago. So maybe the character of Othello isn't that important after all. Well, let's take a closer look at him. We don't meet Othello at the beginning of the play. Instead, we, the audience, are told about him. Iago and Rodrigo are plotting and conspiring against him. They use highly racialized language, and in their scheme to enrage Brabantio, they use language and imagery that was sure to get a reaction from both Brabantio and the audience. When we meet Othello, however, he's calm, he's in control, and he's relaxed. He's in some danger because Brabantio has sent men to confront him, but he does not react. This is a direct contrast to the impassioned, uncontrollable Moor projected by Iago and Rodrigo at the beginning. Remember, this is a play that has an author. So what's Shakespeare trying to do here? Well, he's showing us that Othello does not fit the stereotype of a Moor that his audience would have been somewhat familiar with. And he certainly doesn't match the characteristics that Rodrigo and Iago were describing in scene 1. Also, despite saying that he is not as eloquent as Venetians, Othello displays his control of language when he's before the Duke. He says that he will speak plainly, but it's clear that his is some of the most poetic language in the whole play. Again, this is incompatible with the stereotypical projection of the Moor. So Shakespeare presents us with a character, the only black character in white Venice, but a character who does not fit the stereotypes and views held by many of the other characters, and also, very likely, by the audience as well. Shakespeare emphasizes Othello's nobility, his grace, and all his better qualities, which makes the later events, his complete descent into jealousy and his murder of Desdemona, all the more shocking. The depiction of Othello in these terms make it seem strange that anyone would be able to get the better of him, that someone like Iago would be able to fluster him so much and get under his skin and into his head. But Othello, despite his presentation at the beginning, isn't perfect. He does make a number of errors. He trusts Iago. He believes that his service to the Duke will outweigh his crime against Brabantio, that being of not asking his permission to marry Desdemona. He doesn't realise the seriousness of his cultural misstep in marrying Desdemona in secret, and this is one of the most interesting aspects of Othello. Once he realises that he's out of touch with social expectations in Venice, he begins to see himself as an outsider. He begins to see himself in terms that others do, and he begins to question things. This is the crack that allows Iago in. Once Othello understands that he doesn't and can never belong to Desdemona's world, everything begins to unravel for him.
That was Peter talking about the character of Othello and the many ways that he can be viewed. Next up, you're going to hear him talk about Othello's character from the perspective of an exam question that has appeared on the Leaving Cert in the past.
Othello's foolishness, rather than Iago's cleverness, leads to the tragedy of Shakespeare's Othello. Discuss this statement with reference to the text. This statement is interesting because, in a way, it shifts the blame for what happens in the play from Iago and onto Othello himself, a classic case of victim blaming. And if we examine Othello in this light, can we say that it is in fact Othello's foolishness that causes all the tragedy? If we come back to that word, foolishness, it would be fair to say that Othello is not a foolish man. He's a very well-respected military leader. He is highly thought of amongst the noblemen of Venice, and he is descended from Moorish royalty. Othello is, however, a stranger in Venice. It's important to remember that he is both racially and culturally an outsider. Because of this, he makes mistakes. For example, even though it would have been tradition or custom for a man to ask a woman's father for permission to marry her, he doesn't ask Brabantio's permission before he marries Desdemona in secret. He freely admits that he has little experience with women, and he almost seems afraid of Desdemona at times, keeping her at a distance, travelling separately to Cyprus, for example, and being able to communicate with her when they are in Cyprus. He also trusts Iago completely, which is a grave mistake. It was common practice for states to hire mercenaries, soldiers from other countries, to lead their armies because they didn't trust their own citizens with that sort of military power. Othello is the leader of the Venetian forces for this exact reason. He is surrounded by distrust, and yet he is open and honest and believes that others, specifically Iago, are the same. It would be fair to say that Othello is naive rather than foolish. So can we blame this naivety for the tragedy in the play? Iago's cleverness and Othello's naivety work hand in hand, and the naivety comes from the fact that he's an outsider. For example, Iago is able to exploit Othello's lack of knowledge of Venetian women by suggesting that the women of Venice show God the tricks they do not show their husbands. Othello cannot refute this because he simply doesn't know any different. But can we blame Othello for his ignorance? Remember, Iago also fools Roderigo and Cassio, both Venetians, as well as Desdemona and even for a time his own wife, Emilia. To suggest that Othello's outsider status and ignorance around Venetian customs makes it his fault that he is so mercilessly manipulated by Iago is probably a step too far. Yet, Othello's position makes it easier for Iago to manipulate him, and he must of course bear responsibility for his actions at the end of the play. But that does not diminish the role that Iago plays in exploiting the gaps in Othello's understandings of Venetian society and culture. To answer this question fully then, you need to show your understanding that Othello is naive, yes, and ignorant even at times, but that these things are not character flaws for which he can be held responsible, simply consequences of his outsider status. That Iago exploits them in order to manipulate Othello and bring about the tragedy of the play is something that he alone bears responsibility for.
That was Peter's exploration of how to approach an exam question on Othello's character in the context of whether he could be considered a victim or a fool in this tragic play. In this final segment, you'll hear Peter talk about the character of Othello from the perspective of another exam question.
Shakespeare makes use of the character of Othello to fulfill a variety of dramatic functions in his play Othello. Discuss this statement with reference to the text. Now, often when you're looking at Leaving Cert questions like this one, it can be useful to rephrase it for yourself, to think of it in simpler terms. At the heart of this statement is the question, what is the purpose of Othello? And there are many answers to that question that you could discuss as part of your overall exam response. Now, remember what your examiner is looking for. They want to see evidence of critical literacy. And critical approaches are simply ways of examining or looking at literature. And we're going to look at two critical approaches to the play as a whole, so you can see that there are a number of different things you could say in your answer about Othello's specific purpose. The first critical approach is race. If we consider Othello's blackness to be more than just a marker of his outsider status and instead the central concern of the play, we can view Othello's dramatic purpose as highlighting the impact of racism and social conformity on an individual. London, in Shakespeare's day, had a small population of black people, a group that the Queen herself referred to disparagingly as blackamoors. Shakespeare's audience would have been familiar with the negative stereotypes around black people, and the general reception this community would have faced in London at the time would have been a hostile one. With this in mind, Shakespeare choosing a black character as the title character of the play is interesting. Up until this point, black characters were usually one-dimensional villains, in most plays if they appeared at all. But Shakespeare presents Othello in glowing terms. In fact, he shows how unlike the common stereotypes he is by showing him in direct contrast to what Roderigo and Iago say about him at the very beginning of the play. In fact, what brings Othello down, what destroys him, is the fact that he recognizes his own difference to everyone else. He becomes aware of his outsider status. As Iago's poison works on him and he begins to doubt and distrust Desdemona and Cassio, he begins to blame himself, that he doesn't understand the conventions or rules of Venetian society. He begins to see himself in the racialized, stereotypical terms that some of the other characters do. A common view at the time was that Moors were unable to control their passions, their rage, their lust, and that they were of limited intelligence. The intelligence part is clearly not borne out by Othello, but we do see that by the end, the brutal, uncontrollable nature of Othello has emerged. Shakespeare shows us that he has become exactly what white Venetian society always thought he was, and it has happened because he has recognised that he does not belong and probably cannot ever belong to their world. Perhaps Othello's function, then, is to show the audience what can happen to people who are ostracised because of their race or other factors that make them the other. Now, the second critical approach that we're going to look at is gender and human nature. So other critics have argued that race is not the central element of the play, and instead it's all about human nature and jealousy. From this critical perspective, we could argue that it doesn't matter at all that Othello is black. He suffers jealousy in the same way that any man would when told that his wife was having an affair. Shakespeare then could be showing the audience that all men ultimately are equal, in that they are all flawed and ruled by passions such as jealousy. Iago suspects multiple men have had affairs with his wife Emilia, and his jealousy and sense of inferiority is so strong that he infects Othello with it. Othello's race doesn't protect him from feeling jealous, just as it does not diminish the power that he holds over Desdemona, his wife. Perhaps then, Othello's dramatic function is to highlight to the audience that people of all races are flawed and vulnerable to the feelings of inferiority, inadequacy, and the rage that stems from those feelings, as both Iago and Othello clearly are. Iago's response is to devise the downfall of a number of people, while Othello's is to achieve what he thinks is justice by murdering his wife. Both of these are symptoms of the same drive.
And with that, that's the end of this episode of our Othello podcast series, all about the character of Othello himself, the many sides to his character, and how to approach an exam question based on him.
Keep listening to this series for more analysis on the play Othello. It'll help you gain a better understanding of the play and will equip you with the knowledge on how to approach a Leaving Cert question based on this play by William Shakespeare.
Thank you for listening so far, and as always, if you want to get in touch to leave any feedback, questions or comments you might have for us, you can contact us by email at info@studyclix.ie. You can also chat to us directly on the Studyclix website via the chat box in the bottom right hand corner.
Yes, and as always, don't forget to subscribe to the Studyclix podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you can stay up to date with our latest episodes. If you want to support us, we'd love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or tell a friend about us so we can help as many students as possible.
And don't forget to follow Studyclix on social media if you're not already. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram and TikTok. We're always posting lots of fun stuff, lots of useful study tips and regular competitions, so it's well worth giving us a follow. And of course, a big thank you to Peter Tobin for working with us on this, for bringing his expert advice on the play Othello for Leaving Cert students. We hope you stay tuned for more.